This series of films will be a record of what the interior spaces of the ship was, how we believe it was used, what parts of it are original, and what interesting features might survive. So let's go on board. The main interior space of the ship is on 4 decks that run the full length of the ship: the upper and lower gun decks, the orlop, and the hold. This staircase is where there was a ladder originally that led from here, the upper deck or the main deck or the weather deck, down to the first of the interior decks, the upper gun deck. And here we are on the upper of 2 full gun decks that are the main arming space or military space of the ship. On an English ship in this period, you'd actually call this the middle deck because it's the middle of 3 decks that had cannon. And in Swedish, you would have called it the översta överlopp rather than a deck. But we now refer to it just as the upper gun deck. This is a space that contained 24 large bronze 24-pounder cannon. About a little less than half of the ship's total armament was here. But it was also the primary accommodation space for about half of the crew. They were evenly split, more or less, between this deck and the gun deck directly below. They lived in groups of 6 to 8 people in between the cannon. Slept on the deck, ate their meals there, spent their time off watch there when they weren't working. This is the lower bearing for one of the ship's 3 capstans. These were winches that were used for lifting heavy loads on the ship. This particular one is mounted on the upper deck and is used for handling the rigging or helping to raise an anchor. And it has 2 bearings, an upper and a lower. The lower bearing would normally be in the deck, but in order to get it out of the way, the bearing is suspended from the deck above, a hanging bearing to carry the bottom end of the capstan. It's a solution we don't see very often, but it did appear in some 17th century ships. Here, all the way at the bow of the ship, we have, even though there were cannon up in this part of the ship, when the ship was excavated, this area was mostly being used as storage for personal possessions. When the ship sailed, it had 64 guns, but it has enough gun ports for 72. And one of the questions has always been which 8 gun ports didn't have cannon in them. We know that the 4 in the transom were empty, and the other 4 we've been searching for, and we've recently been able to demonstrate that these 2 forwardmost gun ports on this deck did not have cannon in them, because this is where they were storing lots of personal possessions. And so there were big piles of boxes and chests and barrels in this area when the ship sailed. Fortunately, that area was very well protected when the deck above collapsed and sealed this area. So this is one of the least disturbed parts of the ship, just at the forward end of this deck. This area is also one of the ways to get out of the interior of the ship into the beakhead, the long triangular structure in front of the ship that had 2 main functions. One was to handle the rigging of the sails all the way at the bow, and the other is the ship's 2 toilets. Were located there, the heads. They're still there. And you could get there either by going out these doors, or you could climb down the face of the bulkhead from the upper deck on a staircase built on the outside. One of the things that's surprising about this deck is how much headroom there is. It's part of the explanation for why the ship was unstable and sank. I'm 1.80 meters tall. That's as tall as the tallest person we know of on board, and about 15 centimeters more than the average height. But I can stand up under all the beams without having to duck. And you wouldn't need to be able to stand up under the beams, just between them. So you can see how much headroom I have. It would be possible to lower this deck a considerable amount, maybe 30 centimeters, and still have adequate working room in here. And that would have made the ship much more stable by taking a big slice of structure out of the high part of the ship and lowering the weight of everything else. We don't know why they wanted that much headroom. It clearly isn't for ergonomic reasons. And we know that later ships drastically reduced the amount of headroom in these decks. But that is one of the reasons that Vasa is unstable and sank. Another feature related indirectly to that is, what do you do if you get water in the ship? Vasa has 4 pumps for removing water. They're all designed purely for removing water. You can't hook them up and turn them into fire pumps or anything like that. This is the main pump and the only one that we think was actually functional when the ship sailed. That this is a solid alder log, about 9.5 meters long, that runs all the way from here down to the top of the keel, where it has a copper strainer on it. And then with this brake handle or lever, it moved a piston up and down on the inside with valving so that you could lift water all the way from the bottom of the ship up to this level. It would be spit out on the backside of the log into a lead pipe that ran into a dale or a trough cut in the top of one of the deck beams that ran under the deck and then out through spouts in the sides so you could remove water from the ship. This is the steerage. You steered the ship from here. This stick sticking up through the deck is called a whipstaff. And it's a lever that is connected to the helm, or the tiller connected to the rudder. This is the normal way of steering a ship, from a big ship, from around 1450 until about 1700, when the ship's wheel was invented. And in fact, it lets you have very large rudder angles because you don't just tilt the whipstaff back and forth. At larger angles, you tilt it and push it down through the bearing in the deck so that you can get 22 or 23 degrees of rudder angle to either side, which is perfectly adequate for steering a sailing ship. Now, the person who's steering has to be fairly athletic. With a steering wheel, you stand in one place and you have a lot of mechanical advantage that's about the same no matter what the rudder angle is. With this system, you're constantly dancing back and forth, standing on one side or the other, depending on the direction of the turn. And the bigger the rudder angle, the more effort you have to put into it. You can see the compass. There was originally a cupboard here between the ladders called the bidicle, or noctihus in Swedish. There was a cupboard that contained 2 compasses, one on either side, so you could see one wherever you were standing, and then a lantern in the middle that would illuminate them at night. So you could see the direction you were going. You could look through the doorway and a grating here and see the sails, so you could make sure you had the wind at the right angle to the sails. But you couldn't see in front of the ship. You could only see maybe a little bit onto the deck. You depended on somebody else to know where the ship was going. But this is a military vessel. You're not expected to take independent action. The officer commanding, will give you an order about how to turn the ship. You don't have to worry about what's in front of it. So the restricted view isn't actually that big a problem. But in battle, you are very well protected, which was an important thing if you're the guy steering. The other practical part of the function is that there is sleeping space in this compartment. In fact, the only private accommodation in the entire ship is in here. Even if you lived in the great cabin, you were the king, you shared a cabin with several other people. But here there were 2 small pilot berths, really not much bigger than coffins, one built into either side of the ship against the side about the height of a little higher than the height of a table, with a sliding door in the front that you could open and crawl in and sleep. So those are those 2 people, who we think are probably the ship's navigators, the pilots, were probably the people who slept in those 2 pilot berths. They call them pilot berths for a reason. The other major function of this room is if you're looking this way. In that case, this is now an antechamber. It is a room that prepares you to enter the next room, because behind that bulkhead is the great cabin. This is where the king would stay if he were on board, or an admiral commanding a fleet. And you would have been reminded of that when you came in, because when you first come into this room, you would notice 7 putti playing musical instruments, life-sized little boys affixed to the bulkhead up there. One of the researchers who studied this believes that this wall was painted to look like stone, So you would have the impression of leaving the wooden world of the ship and entering the stone world of a palace. When you stepped into the great cabin, you actually stepped into a room within a room. What we see here now is the structural part of the ship. The ceiling that are the heavy structural planks on the inside of the framing, the deck beams and the structure above, the heavy cross-timbered bulkhead that supports the mast. But in 1628, all of that was covered with a completely separate skin, a second layer of very high quality paneling, a coffered ceiling that filled the space between the beams. The mizzen mast was enclosed in a closet. Everything that gave away that you were on board a ship was covered. Instead, this interior was made to look like a room in the palace. It was made out of the same quality materials that you would find in the palace, all very, very straight-grained, radially converted, knot-free, expensive imported oak, probably from Poland. It is elaborately finished. In addition to all of the paneling, there are windows with glass in them. That's very rare. Even in buildings on land, glass was very expensive. And so to have glassed windows was a sign of wealth, a sign of prestige. You had these small arched windows on the side. Your attention would be drawn to them by a carved surround. And then here behind me, in this bulkhead, we have a large, essentially a picture window that was made, it was filled with leaded glass panels in clear glass. This would let light into the room from farther aft, but it would also be a reminder of the wealth and prosperity of the owner who could afford such a large window on something like a ship. The people who designed this room used the ship's own shape to emphasize the room's function. Because the ship gets narrower towards the stern and the deck rises, the architects who designed this room and its function used that effectively. If you come into the room at the far end, you are downhill from the host who would be standing here at this end. In addition, the headroom in this deck changes. It's slightly greater when you first come in and slightly less here. So I appear to have less headroom than you would have when you come in the door. And that emphasizes that. It creates a false perspective or forced perspective that gives the impression not only that this room is longer than it really is, but it also creates the impression that the host is taller than he really is. If the king receives visitors here, it directly establishes the relationship between the people coming in. It's a brilliant conceit, a brilliant trick, executed with the finest materials and the finest craftsmanship. The people who lived in the great cabin also had this private space behind the great cabin itself. Very few people probably would have come in here. It's not very large, but it had a number of features that were useful to how the ship was organized socially. It also provided a couple of features that were useful just to the people who lived on this level. There's storage here. There's a locker here, in fact, on each side. But in fact, what appears to be a locker on the port side is in fact a staircase that's hidden behind that bulkhead, so that the people in the great cabin and the people in the upper cabin could go up and down that staircase and communicate with each other without having to go out into the ship. In addition, there were quarter galleries. These are actually large enough to use, unlike the ones on the level above. The door is easy to go through. It would have been guarded, once again, by a pair of herms and a big, heavy carved lintel with foliage all over it. We have that in storage. And then there's a large enough space to walk around out there. And in fact, there's a little gun port at the forward end that's at the right height for a musket, so that you could put a musketeer out there who would be able to shoot down along the side of the ship and take care of anyone who was trying to sneak in under the cannon in a boat. You also had a defense against people close to the ship from this room. There are 4 small round gun ports here with a hole in the beam right under them, and these are for swivel guns. These are small anti-personnel cannon mounted on a fork that could pivot. So you aim them like a great big musket. And so these 4 positions would allow you to shoot at people who might try to come and disable the rudder. There's no evidence that any of those guns were mounted when the ship actually sailed, but the ship was provided with a place for them. And just above them, you have what are probably glass windows that let in quite a lot of light. Although I have to imagine that if you fired a cannon right here by the glass window, that was the end of the window. One of the prevailing myths about Vasa is that it was greatly altered while it was being built, that the king ordered an extra deck added to the ship or ordered the ship to be made longer after they'd started construction. In fact, there's no evidence for those changes at all. The ship as it stands in the museum today is more or less the ship they intended to build from the moment they signed the contract. However, there are some smaller alterations that were made while the ship was being built, very typical ones for the construction of any big wooden structure. They added a hatch in the deck here by basically sawing a hole in the deck, or moved a ladder from one place to another. One of the most significant alterations is here in the stern castle. The entire stern castle structure was lengthened from what it was originally intended to be. That required lengthening the quarterdeck by about 1.5 meters to 2 meters. It required moving bulkheads from where they'd originally intended to be. And the mizzen mast had originally intended to stand a little bit farther aft, and it was moved forward. And we can see traces of those changes by seeing what had already been built. And so this line right here, this seam between the planks, you can see is a vertical line where these 3, well in fact 4 planks all end while this one continues. This is where the stern castle was supposed to stop. The room we're standing in should have been that much farther aft, and instead of ending up here, it should have ended somewhere around about here. And so after they decided to make all the cabins longer, they then had to add these planks to extend the interior of this room a little bit more. And so we can see what the original configuration was supposed to be. We can also see the original end of the deck above to get an idea. We can even see where we think they wanted the mizzen mast to stand beforehand. We don't know why they did that. It could be that the captain who was responsible for rigging the ship thought that the mizzen mast needed to be farther forward for the ship to sail well. That is a kind of change we know about from other ships historically. It could be that somebody like the king decided that the great cabin wasn't big and fine enough, and so that the cabin needed to be made bigger. And if you did that, you couldn't then have the mizzen mast stand in the middle of it. You had to move it with the bulkhead. The problem is, this tells us what was done. It doesn't really tell us clearly why it was done.